Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Bonnie. I'm the founder of Angular Nation, and I'm your host today. Before we jump in, I want to thank our friends at AG Grid for partnering with us on the session, which I don't want to be too much of a nerd, but I got to tell you, I'm super, super excited about our topic and our guest today. Let me let Valentine in. Okay, so first, I was excited already because we have one of my all-time favorite guests, Alex Rickabaugh, who is super cool, super chill, super fun, and he's always working on really cool stuff. So you want to say hi, Alex? Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hello, happy to be here.
It's so good to have
Thank
you.
For having me. Yeah.
We'd love to have you. Okay, so Alex was here a few months ago and he did a standalone component spike, which was very cool. It was like, not ready yet. And then later we saw the official RFC come out, and I think it was, I just love to get like a sneak peek of what's coming next. And so that was really cool to see that come out in the official channels. So this month I asked Alex if he could come back again and show us like the next, like what's going on behind the scenes. I love it. And he said yes. And he said, can we talk about strictly typed forms? And I was like, yes, please. Take me. So I was super excited about this. I used to do a lot of enterprise consulting, and I used to work a lot with forms. And so this is very dear to my heart. And I talked to a lot of people, and I know that a lot of people have been asking for this feature, this typed forms is a thing that people have been kind of, begging for. So I'm sure a lot of other people are excited about this too. Okay, so I was excited about Alex. I was excited about the topic. And then he asked me if he could bring his colleague, Dylan. And I was like, yeah, any friend of yours is a friend of mine, obviously. So I said, yes, bring Dylan along. Because apparently Dylan's also working on this, right? So he wanted us to meet Dylan. And then this morning, Samantha and I are stalking Dylan online. We're just looking for like a profile pic so we can do a little, promo image. And then we found Dylan's YouTube channel. And we're like, oh my goodness, this guy, he's like playing all these instruments. He's really good. So now we're super obsessed with Dylan. So if we get time, Dylan, maybe you can play something for us. So
paste the link. Paste the link.
Yes, I definitely will. You have to see his YouTube channel. So
it's like a very old channel.
It's so cool, Dylan. I'm like, yeah, so we're big fans of yours now.
Well, thank you.
So it's an honor to meet you. We're very excited to meet you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that, we're going to talk about strictly typed forms. We're very excited about this. I really want to ask you guys, well, we should start with, set it up for us. And we talk, because I really want to talk first always about what problem we're solving and why we need this in the first place. I don't know if you're allowed to share any docs with us or anything like that, but just tell us what you've got so far. And,
yeah, so I've actually put together, like a quick 5-minute presentation just to highlight the background and then some of the key design issues.
Perfect.
If you're interested, I'll present here.
You're so professional.
Yeah. While Dylan's setting that up, I think this is going to be really interesting. And what we want to do here is kind of get everyone thinking about some of the challenges of adding types to forms. And I think that'll be really useful because we're kind of still in the process of figuring out the exact design that we're planning on going with and doing all the kind of internal review for that. Assuming we land on something that everyone agrees is like, yeah, that's the right approach. You'll probably see an RFC on this. And I think it'll be really valuable to have everyone kind of already have a little bit of context on that and be able to come into the RFC and engage with us on providing feedback on the topic, knowing some of the problems already.
Absolutely.
So,
and we
Dylan,
can send you a link
away.
to this episode too, if you want to include that.
Yeah.
That'd be cool.
So yeah, as Alex mentioned, this is super early in the design process. We, have certainly not finalized the design yet. So I just want to highlight some of the key issues in addition to some context. So food for thought about type forms. So I'll start with a minute or two about the motivation for adding strong types to forms. So imagine for a second that you are hosting a party. So this little interface here represents some of the things you might want in a schema for a party. It has an address, a property, whether or not it's formal, and some choices of food. So let's build a form that lets you represent a party. And you might do that something like this, where in reactive forms, you construct a form group and then have nested form controls for each of those fields. With today's Forms API, it is really, really unsafe. If you try to access the value of this entire form group, it has type any. If you try to get a particular field, like let's say address.street, that should be a string, it just has type any. If you try to set the value of control, it takes a value of type any. So this is very error prone. So the goal with type forms is to improve this situation into something more like this, where the value has a type of the proper shape. When you access an individual control inside this party form, you get the correct type, etc. So we have a couple key goals that we want to address here. We want to improve the developer experience for reactive forms specifically. We want to avoid fragmentation. In particular, we don't want multiple versions of the Forms API floating around and people end up with apps that use both versions. We want to provide as much type safety as we can, and we want to support gradual typing. So if you have a big Forms app, you should be able to gradually add types to it. You shouldn't have to do it all in one go. So with that said, let's dive into a couple of the key design questions that we've been mulling over. As a first example, let's consider this form control representing a dog. And then you reset it. And after you reset it, the value of the control becomes null. And this is an assumption that's sort of baked into the forms library on a really fundamental level, which is that any control or any group can be reset at any time. And if you reset it, it just takes on null as its value. So it's really not, I think it's really not at all obvious here how to support this with strong types. And as I see it, there are a couple of options. One option would be to try to prevent a client from calling the .reset method on a control that isn't nullable. So it turns out that this actually is possible to do using, sort of a little bit of type hackery, but you can prevent the .reset method from being callable if the control is not nullable. Another approach you could do, which is one that I'm sort of favoring, is you could allow the user to provide a default value for every form control. So this would be a new feature that's not currently supported today. And that way, when you reset it, you're guaranteed to get a default value, which is in the type that is expected. So you'd provide a string default value, and this would reset to a string. But yeah, there are a couple ways to deal with this, and it's it really can be a bit tricky when you're looking at these large groups. What happens when you reset them? So another question we're thinking about is the underlying type of a form group. So consider this example where you have a house, and the house has an address plus some other fields. So the type of this form group could be, whoops, I lost my second bit here. The type of this form group could be either a value type or a control type. And when we say a value type, we would mean the type is a dictionary where the address is a form group with string. A control type would be a form group with a form control of string. So basically the question is like, do we want to reflect these forms types like form group and form control or not in the type T on this outer form group? And there are advantages. Yeah, that's a good summary, Alex. Thanks. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. The primary advantage to using a value type, where T is just the type of the data model inside, like string, is that it's really natural and easy to work with. When you go to specify these types, you can say, oh, I already have this interface that represents a street address. Let me just reuse it in my forms model. But there's some major drawbacks as well, which is that when you're looking here at house.address, it's impossible to disambiguate with value types whether that inner object is a form group and that object came from a form group.value, or whether it's just some abstract control that actually happens to have an object as its value. And this, I think, happens fairly commonly with people defining custom form controls. So there are some tricky trade-offs here as well. Another area to highlight is disabling controls. So here I have another little example form group. It's a cat, which has a name and lives. And who knows what happens when you call .disable on the lives control? Radovan?
The validation is not activated, or it's deactivated for a while. It is disabled. Am I wrong, or okay?
So that does happen, and even stronger. In addition, this lives field will actually not show up in the .value. It'll be completely gone from the .value. So when you call cat.value, it'll be an object that only contains the key name. The key lives will be completely missing. So this raises some sort of big questions about what the correct type of cat.value should be. Because arbitrary keys can be missing if they are disabled on the parent group. So the solution we're leaning towards here is to use a partial type where we would say something like, I'll type it in the chat. We have some object with all the keys, and we say the type of .value is a partial of that object, where some of the keys might be present and some of the keys might not be present. But this is a bit tricky, in particular, in how it interacts with other design issues that I've mentioned. So another topic, and this is one last topic that I thought was kind of interesting to discuss, is removing controls. So again, with this cat example, the form group API has a .remove control method, which will completely delete a key. And it's not super obvious, again, here, what the type of cat.value should be. In particular, cat.raw value as well. .raw value is supposed to give you the value type containing all controls, even disabled controls. So there are a couple ways to deal with this. One way that a lot of people have suggested on the GitHub issue is just to completely ban removing controls from a form group and then create a new type, maybe called form record. So we'd have two separate types, one for mutable form groups and one for immutable form groups. Another way to deal with this might be to require removable controls to be optional. So you'd explicitly specify a type, and you'd say here that name is form control or undefined. Or maybe you'd say name ? Is a form control. And then we would only let you remove undefined keys. But that brings with it its own implementation challenges. So that's just sort of a quick sampling of a couple, a couple core design issues that we've been thinking about. So yeah, that is all I have for you today in regards to presentation. And now let's maybe open it up for discussion.
And we just had Emma join. Hi, Emma. And Thanis Padromo. And Oye's here. Okay, raise your hands, guys, if you have questions, comments. I know we can count on Sonder, but I also want to open up for if anybody, because I really like to start with beginner stuff. If anybody who hasn't really seen a lot of this, if you guys have questions, feel free to jump in and ask, comments, anything. Sonder?
Yeah, most of my thing is wondering why you want to control all of this. Well, template-driven forms do this automatically for you.
Yeah, so with template-driven forms today, if you go in and grab the underlying form group, it's actually not type safe. So you still have this problem where when you're calling methods on the underlying controls, you can set it to values that are not compatible with the intended type. You can add and remove controls freely. So I actually don't think you really get these benefits with template-driven forms.
Yeah, I think template-driven forms have the same issue that Dylan showed in kind of the first couple slides, where if you actually look at the .value coming out of it, it's any. ng model knows nothing about the type of the control that it's actually working with.
And it would actually be more difficult to do the types in template-driven forms. It's not really practical, right?
There's a couple challenges there, which is why we've kind of chosen to go for reactive forms as the first target. Two of the really big problems are, one, in Angular, we actually don't have a syntax or a way to specify types in templates. And so one of the nice things about the doing it in a reactive form side in TypeScript is, in most cases, right, you'll just say new form control and you pass a value, and given the type of that value, we can infer what the type of the control is. But if you need, if that's not sufficient, or if we get it wrong, right, TypeScript you can actually go in and explicitly say, this is a form control of some type that I'm trying to create. So, you may be passing a string to initialize it, but you know that, like, in reality, it can be a string or a number. Sander?
Actually, you can define types in templates because most inputs have like type is text, number, date.
Yeah.
Radio buttons are pretty much Booleans. checkboxes are pretty much booleans. So if you look at your template, you can already pretty much have a very accurate guesstimate of what the form should be. Then I have another concern about forms altogether is if the types are that important, it should be checked in the model and not in all the logic in between.
Well, we know how passionate you are, Sander, about template-driven forms, which I love you for that. But also, I
really like the idea, and I'm here to see where it's going and to see what problem it's solving. Perhaps it will make me like reactive forms a little bit more, or hate it a little bit less.
It's funny for me because Sander and I rarely disagree on anything. I love reactive forms, like I do. So maybe it's just my opinion. Ronan, I was actually very curious to see how you would feel about this because you're using forms quite a bit, aren't you?
Yeah. Like we've loads of forms in our apps, and some of them are quite complex. It was interesting what you were saying about not being able to remove form controls, because we have one scenario where sometimes we'll have like a form array where you can add rows and remove rows, and each row will have like a form group with more controls. So we found for those really advanced ones, having all the logic in a class or a service is helpful, for just defining the whole thing. But I'm very excited about this because for one reason, all of our form controls have 2 getters and 1 setter, so that we can have strict values. So a getter for the value, a getter for the observable value change, and a setter for setting it, because we have to do that quite a lot. So if we have a big form, sometimes we'll have to create a service because we have so many getters and setters. So if we could just have generic types when we're defining the form, it would remove so much code and maintenance for us.
Yeah, you brought up something really interesting there, which is dynamic form arrays. And there's sort of an interesting set of design problems around them when you think about heterogeneous versus homogeneous arrays. So if you have some array of type T, and you try to push a new control onto the end of the array, what should the type of the new control that you pass in be? And in particular, if you have a form array with a bunch of strings, should you be allowed to add a number array to the end of it? And if we allow that, it's actually quite difficult to figure out how to have a strict safe type for the push method. So in the case where you're dynamically modifying a form array, I think actually makes a lot of sense to enforce the types be homogeneous, or otherwise require that the shape of the array be constant so that we know what type occurs at which index. So that actually is a whole other category of really interesting design questions that you just touched on.
No, definitely. Whenever we do that, we have our logic to add that new row. We force it to be a certain type because we'll also have our UI render, for that type. So it all has to be homogeneous. Yeah.
TypeScript has the same issue with its arrays, right? If you have a normal array in TypeScript of strings, you're not allowed to just add a number to the end of it. But because form array is historically untyped, it was perfectly possible to have a form array where the first control in the array is a string and the second control in the array is a number. So you can have kind of mismatched types in form arrays today. And so one of the things we have to think about is, given all the code that's already out there that might be doing this, right? What restrictions make sense for the way a typed form array will behave? And are there use cases like having these heterogeneous arrays that we just won't be able to support in typed forms?
Could we define an interface for them?
So what you can do is say, I have a form array that is either string or number controls. And then it's perfectly legal to push either one of those to the array. The trade-off that you make is then when you look at any individual control, you don't necessarily get any information about whether it's a string or a number control.
You need a type guard at that point, would you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to put that concretely, if you have your array of number or string and you say array.control sub0.value, you'll get back a number or string, and you'll have to test to see which one it is. Whereas if your array is read-only, if it's a const array or a tuple, then we can make the type system tell you, oh, the thing at index 0 is a string, at index 1 is a number. So heterogeneous arrays make more sense in the const tuple setting than they do in the mutable array setting.
And this is exactly the kind of thing that I think is really interesting to get people thinking about before the RFC, because this is one of the questions we'll probably want to have the community answer for us, is like, how useful are these heterogeneous arrays? How much are they used? Does it make sense to try to accommodate them more formally in the design, or is it maybe okay if we, stick with homogeneous form arrays and you can use untyped forms if you need to do something outside of that?
I would say in all the example I was given, they're all homogeneous because it's just all the rows are gonna be the same. Yeah.
I think you're going to have a good mix of people that don't care and people who feel very strongly about it.
Yep, that tends to be how it goes.
Yeah. And it's sort of, I think sort of the trade-off here is, do we support them as two use cases with two separate classes? Do we try to support them together in one class and sort of weaken the type guarantee? Or do we not support heterogeneous at all? Sort of three paths as I see it.
Very good questions. All right, Matteo.
Hello.
Hey.
So, first, I feel privileged to be sharing directly with you guys. I've been working on a dynamic forms library this year, made open source because I convinced my lead to share it with the world instead having privately in the company. And yeah, my expectation was to type the forms with the model, the final value or raw value. And looking at the PR, I'm seeing the form array being typed with an array of form controls of numbers. It's like a deep sequence of types there. So the idea is to have this kind of form controls in the middle of the typing, or we could just use the interface of the form array that we expect it to output. What's the idea there? Thank you.
Yeah, so that is a really interesting issue. I was sort of trying to get at that with the talk of value versus control types. So imagine that we have some form array, we'll call it foo, and you say foo.value, and that gives you let's assume we're using value types here as you suggested. That would give you an array of strings here. And that has the advantage that you can use it with your existing data model. Let's say you have a form array of interfaces, like student interfaces. You can use your existing student interface and just construct a form array around it. But it has a disadvantage too, which is that the thing inside this .value is just going to be an abstract control of array of string, or an abstract control of array of object in the group case. And you can't tell whether the things inside came from calling the .value on forms classes, or whether they came from custom form control implementations that just happen to have array values or object values. And the inability to tell the answer to that makes it difficult to add strong types to some of the other methods like .get, because you can't guarantee that this thing that's shaped like an array actually was a form array, or that this thing that's shaped like an object actually was a form group. So there are trade-offs for sure between using control types and value types. And this is something that we are probably going to solicit feedback on in the RFC. I will say, using control types, it is possible to have stronger types overall for the system. Using value types, you have to make assumptions about the shapes of array valued and object valued things that are not always accurate.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, the way I think about this is if a form array is an array of controls, right? And those controls might be other form arrays, they may be groups that have complex objects, or they might just be plain form controls of some value, right? And that value could be an object, we don't know. And so when you put the controls in a form array, does the form array remember what type those controls were, whether they were groups or arrays or values? Or does the form array kind of forget about this information and just think of itself as an array of some values. And if it remembers what types the controls are, then when you later get those controls out, you get much more useful information than if it forgets what type of control it had inside of it.
I love these discussions.
In that case, you just end up with an abstract control, and you can't tell whether the thing inside the abstract control, oh, this originally came from a form array, or it just came from some form control that has an array value.
Yeah, and as Tom said, like at that point, you would need like a type guard to start to try to distinguish these things again. So it makes it like more burdensome for the person using the array to interact with the controls inside of it.
It's a good question.
I had kind of the same approach when I first started thinking about this problem. Was, you know, oh, it's a form control. It has a type. Like the type is the thing inside the control, obviously, right? And it turns out that if you take this design and actually try to expand it, you start to encounter all these issues of like, yes, that would work, but then you wouldn't be able to type this API, or then you would, you know, this use case would be a lot harder. So it wasn't quite as straightforward as we originally thought.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky.
Yeah.
You haven't even given us a chance to break it yet. Good question, Mateo.
I know Sander's just waiting there with his hammer ready to bang on it.
I know. We can always count on Sander. Aristides.
Hey, Dylan. Hey, Alex. Okay. I was wondering if if the underlying type would be propagated to the value changes observable also.
Yes. Yeah. Our plan is to add types to as many APIs as we can. And it definitely should be possible to type value changes.
Cool. Thanks.
Cool. Tom White.
Hi there, Alex, and hi there, Dylan. Really nice to hear from you guys. I suppose you've answered most of my questions already, and you're already talking at a higher level than I would have bothered to consider. But I suppose for me, I use forms a lot, both with builders and just in reactive forms. And my thinking is, as far as support for these edge cases, not for your APIs, but for you, supporting how people have maybe implemented forms previously because it was a bit too wild west and a bit too open. My feeling is the same about any type of typing within TypeScript is, look, guys, if you were naughty before, you know, just use any or use an or type that just wraps all the types that it could be, and then just go away and do that, and then hopefully fix yourselves later. But really, strict typing is the only true correct path. So I'd be inclined to just say, let's not worry about those sort of edge cases and force them to do the right thing and how they should have built it in the first place.
Don't you just love Tom White?
I want to slow clap you, like. Dylan, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the rollout strategy.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we want this to be totally gradually typed and intercompatible with people who have older forms applications that they can't entirely migrate. So we want you to be able to add an explicit anywhere generic is expected, and get exactly the same behavior that you had before. And then as you're ready to start adding types to parts of your app, you can start removing those any's, and you'll get inferred types, and you can see, does this break my app? Well, actually, we're changing very little about the runtime behavior, so we'll see, does this break my compile? But basically, our migration strategy then is going to be to go through, identify all the call sites, and add any's. And then when you're ready, you can start removing these any's to adopt type forms. So yeah, I guess in principle, if you have some super heterogeneous array that you're adding and removing elements of different types to all over the place, and you can't strictly type it, you could just leave those any's on there, and that'll be supported indefinitely. Or that's the idea, at least.
I love the fact that you want to do this without breaking all the code that's already out there, which I know is more challenging, but that's how the Angular team rolls, y'all.
And that is always the hard part of these design kind of plans. Is it's very easy to say, well, if we could just rebuild it or just like, you know, design it in a vacuum, right, and not have to worry about all the existing code, then it would be beautiful, and we could have these types that flow perfectly through the system, and like all of these problems go away. But we live in the real world, and we have, you know, like many millions of lines of Angular code out there, and we can't just ignore it. You know, we've made a commitment to always try to bring the community with us, and that includes, you know, typed forms.
We appreciate that. We love you. We appreciate you not leaving us behind, because we have all this code that we have to maintain. So that's really good.
Yeah, it would be appealing to, you know, come back with, I think somebody mentioned this earlier in the chat, but come back with like a reactive forms module too. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of these design problems we want to fix are so fundamental that there's no way to automatically migrate if we don't think about how is this backwards compatible as part of the design.
And I feel like you guys have very strong feelings about the idea of forking something to make something else. Do you want to speak to that?
We want to avoid it, essentially, if at all possible. You know, there may be like pieces in the future that are so broken and so wrong that we have to do something like that. But every design that we make, our first consideration is always like, how are we going to get from where we are to where we want to end up? And if the answer is not an automatic migration, then it would have to be extremely justified to have that kind of a breaking change, and to ask our community to deal with that.
Yeah. Okay, so much good stuff going on. I see comments in the chat that are really interesting, but we also have hands up, so I'm going to keep moving with the hands. Rob, what you got, Rob?
No, I was wondering if maybe we can set up set value or patch value to get the type through there. So you can set whenever you set the value, you can also specify the type at the same time. Because I know that the value right now is any. You know, put a generic type there so we can specify any type we want at that point.
So our plan definitely involves adding a type to set value. As far as letting you dynamically specify a type on set value, we need to know all the information about the types in the model at compile time. So it's very tricky to allow people to dynamically specify types. I'm not sure what exactly that would look like. Do you have any comments on this, Alex?
Yeah. So the way types work, and this is the TypeScript thing, right, is the type of a value, or really types are associated with variables, not instances of things. And so when you create a field in your component to store your form group or your form array, you give it a type at that moment. And the type can't be changed later while you're interacting with that object. So it's not like you have a form control that can change from a form control of strings to a form control of numbers. You have to tell TypeScript up front what it's going to hold. And so by the time you get to actually calling set value, the only values you'll be allowed to pass into that form control or form group or whatever are values of the type that you said it would hold before. So yes, like set value, patch value will have correct types, but they won't be changing the type of the control. You'll be kind of required to conform to what the type is already. Unless you type it as form control of any, and then you get to still do anything you want.
Right, that makes sense.
Bonnie, you're muted.
Thank you, Alex. Don't put your hand down, Rob, because I'll get confused and call on you again. And we have come back to our lovely favorite troublemaker, Sonder.
I have a tiny question. How much typing do I have to do to get the typings right?
So ideally, the types will be inferred based on your usage in the constructor. If you want something fancy, like you want a union type, you're constructing it with a string, but you actually want it to be a string or number, you would have to specify that explicitly. But in principle, a well-designed type forms library, all the basic uses should be inferred. You shouldn't have to add any explicit typing.
So the most physical typing you will have to do, hopefully for most people, will be to delete the any's.
Yeah.
Just have to press your delete key a bunch of times.
Oh, that would be fun. Love it. Love it. Love it. Tom White.
So I've just got a sort of, it's a bit of an outside question now, because I like what I'm hearing. I suppose, the natural question is, when can I have it? Because obviously we've been sort of wrapping, reactive forms in types ourselves, using whatever ways we could up to now. And we've been doing it for a while. We really want that. But I think we also want some extensibility on the form group object and maybe form array object, so that we can add things. We want to do stuff with it. Messaging, for error messages, and to do funky stuff like build our forms, build our templates with it. So we can replace things like, dare I say it, formally, or at least have it as one object rather than several that just float together and have to wiggle and break, if you see what I mean. I'm after some extensibility. When can we have that?
So the matter of making these abstract control objects like form control and form group and form array extensible is like a big problem, in that there are a lot of potential individual features there, and I'm not sure how to slot it into one feature request, or one here's how we're going to fix it. Sorry, I know that's not exactly a satisfying answer, but yeah, I feel like the extensibility of these objects in general, just there's like potentially a lot to do there.
Yeah,
sometimes we get excited. We just want to see what we can get away with.
So
yeah,
one of the
absolutely true.
One of the constraints I gave Dylan when we're kind of first embarking on this journey, right, was let's try to type the existing behavior as much as possible and not change the way forms behave at all. So we don't want any runtime differences. We just want the types to be better. It turns out that was not that was too optimistic of a goal. There are cases where it makes sense to tweak the runtime behavior just a little bit, in a backwards compatible way, to make the types far easier to deal with. And you'll see kind of more of that as we go through the design process into RFC. But yeah, so we're not looking at kind of extending the behavior as part of this project. That said, we are definitely open to feature requests for forms in general. So feel free to file those on the issue tracker.
I'll take that as an order. I will do so.
Yeah. As far as when can you have it, I'll kind of repeat what Dylan pointed out at the beginning of this, which is, this is still early in the design process. We are not sure that the prototype design that we have is actually going to work. One of the reasons we go through all of this validation and talk to the community with RFCs is, someone might come up and say, I have this use case that completely breaks the design. And then we have to go back to the drawing board. So the real answer to when can we have it is we don't know yet. It really depends on the outcome of all this discussion that we have to have.
Yeah, and there are some dark corners, especially involving removing controls, both from form groups and form arrays. So when we do the RFC, I mentioned this in the chat a second ago, we are going to have a downloadable version of the package, so people can try it and tell us how we broke things. And we can figure out, we didn't even anticipate, this use case. And,
you're doing what?
Figure out how to fit everything into the types if possible.
I think that would be super cool. I actually have a dynamic reactive form, or a thing that I wrote a long time ago that I use for teaching, and I want to see if I can update it and get it working. It'd be cool. Okay, Alex, did you want to? No, Aris?
I think
Alex?
Aristides was ahead of me, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Ari.
Yeah. Are we going to have are we going to be able to pass the types from the form builder service also?
Yeah, the plan is yes. It's I think it shouldn't be too hard to add types to Form Builder. Well, we'll see how it progresses as we go through the design phase, but I would very much like to do that.
Okay, thanks.
That's awesome. If anybody else has questions or comments, you should put your hand up because we are getting a little bit close to the top of the hour. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of finish my thoughts from earlier around the template-driven forms, because I know that is probably a common question on a lot of people's minds, some more than others. Yeah, and so we kind of made the decision early on that we would not attempt to cover template-driven forms in this design. And I wanted to kind of explain a little bit of the thinking behind that. So as the RFC comes out and you guys actually like start engaging with it, you can have a bit stronger of an understanding of like why you don't see template-driven forms very much there. And we'll definitely discuss that as part of the RFC. But there are, as I said before, kind of two fundamental problems. One is that in templates, we don't have a way of specifying types. We do, as Sander pointed out, have a way of inferring types. So if you put a ng model on an input, right, that's like type text, we can be pretty sure that that's going to be a string, and we can try to have ng model infer that it's going to be a string. There's some issues with that. I'll get into that. But in the case that you actually want your control, like you have some, you're not using a native control, you're using something from a library that supports a bit more complex of a type. I consider it a requirement to have the ability to override what type inference does and say, I want this to be my type. I don't want to use a normal object. I want to put my interface in there. And that is not something that we can do in Angular templates today. You don't have a good way of saying, I want to talk about a type. Templates only work in terms of bindings and values. The second challenge with typing template-driven forms is that the way types work in template today, each directive, like ng model, like the control value accessors that you get with form controls, like ng model group, every directive gets its type in isolation. And that means that if you have 3 ng model controls in a form, even if we could get them to be typed correctly themselves, the moment you have like an ng model group that's trying to roll up those 3 controls into some larger object, or the top level form itself, it's not able to kind of look at what else is in the template to figure out its own type. The way that you can do if you say like, I want to create a new form group out of a bunch of form controls, right? You just specify the form controls and the form group kind of already understands that, it has 2 string controls and a number. We can't do that with ng model group or ng form at the top level. And so we would need to build some features into Angular first to make typing much easier in templates in order for template-driven forms to actually work well with the type system that we've created. The good news is that is entirely a possible thing we could do. And so we're typing the classes that we're talking about here, like abstract control, is the fundamental thing that underpins all form controls, whether reactive or template-driven. And so this design, we're hoping, can be extended to template-driven forms once Angular supports those things.
So cool. How do you feel about that, Sander?
Well, I'm looking forward to more strict type checking in templates altogether. That would be a really, really welcome addition. I also wonder about the added value of this whole type system, because with forms, I'm always thinking about data models, and data models need to be checked outside of forms also. Probably you remember someone telling you, hey, if you send it to the server, you need to validate it on the server too.
But I really liked validating it in the forms, because it doesn't even get to you just tell the user right then and there if it's wrong. Like, I love that.
You need to do both. You cannot do one or the other. You need to do both. And the nice thing is, if you use a proper library for this, you can basically reuse the same code front end and back end. And I have set up systems that work like that, that do like model-driven validations and just feedback the model, the validation results back into the thing. The problem I have is that type checking only guards against mistakes you make while writing this thing, and the mistakes you make are while you are writing out your forms array thing, control thing, and you don't have to write those for template-driven forms. So the type checking isn't as much needed there. Just a thought.
We can always count on Sonder to give us a hard time. We love you, Sonder. Well, between Sonder and Tom White, the Angular team has lots of job security. You guys are not going to go anywhere, hopefully, for a while. We have so many more features. Okay, we're running out of time. Rob, I saw your hand go up. Did you have another question?
No. Was Sander talking about, creating interfaces for models for the actual forms so that it's easier to, I guess, give it a type? Is that what you were referring, Sander?
No, your data should be already typed. And
right.
A form is just an abstraction over your data. So you can infer indeed the stuff from your model. The thing is, you don't need this extra type checking during programming, only if you are writing out those things by hand by using reactive forms instead of template-driven forms.
And remember, Sonder's a purist. So if he was going to cook Thanksgiving dinner, everything would be from scratch. He would probably churn his own butter too.
I think it's worth pointing out that template-driven and reactive forms it's not an exclusively either-or choice. I think there are a lot of applications out there actually that mix them, and you can reach inside and grab the form control from something you declared as an ng model, and explicitly call abstract control APIs on it. And if you start doing that without this aspect of type safety, you could easily end up putting data in there that's not compatible with whatever type you said it had in your template.
Yeah, my saying is that your model validation should catch those things, but that's a different discussion. I get the value of the system, no problem there.
Right.
But
yeah, if you try to catch these things with model validation at runtime, you submit the contents of the form. That I think that sort of is geared towards achieving a different objective. Whereas having strict types on the API itself is primarily for the purpose of developers. You can, while you're developing, you get useful type hints. You can say, oh, the type of this thing I added is correct. On the other end, when you're validating your model, when you submit it, when the user clicks submit, either on the front end or the back end, that is more about the correctness of the data. So I think these things are actually kind of orthogonal and complementary, in that having these checks at runtime doesn't necessarily say anything about whether you want to be able to have these checks at compile time as well. Like, one is for the developer, the other is for the correctness of the data.
Yeah, there is no type you can put in a form that will validate that something is a good email address or a phone number or something like that. Like that kind of validation has to be kind of outside of the type system, at least for now.
You guys got Sonder nodding over there. That's impressive.
The thing is, it's right. The problem is you need those types if you are going to write out the reactive form in your controller, and you don't need those types if you're not doing that by using template-driven forms, which is so much easier because then Angular writes most of those things for you. I totally agree. If you are going to pull in there and then pull out those control access value validators and stuff like that, that's where typing would be handy. But that is usually done deep inside of library functions, which don't know what type they are getting anyway.
Well, we're running out of time, my dear. So I think I saw Tom Eustace put a hand up. We're going to make that the last question. We're almost at the top of the hour.
I did, and I retreated it because I wasn't sure. But I was just wondering, will there be a compiler option? Like, could you enable strict reactive forms like you can for strict templates? Will that make sense?
So we are going to include a schematic which will add explicit any's to all the call sites for form control, form group, form builder, and you can opt in to strict type forms by removing these any's. This is our plan, at least. So there won't be a compiler flag. It will just be turned on for everybody, and then you can opt out of it as needed on a control by control basis with these any's that we've inserted. So you would just remove them when you're ready to turn it on.
Okay.
Is it going to insert those any's for the things it can infer also?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So like we have to do it unconditionally, right? Because we don't necessarily know whether the inferred type will work in your application. So the idea is, like, whenever this lands, the migration plan is that your code before the migration will be untyped forms because forms won't support types, and your code after the migration will also be using untyped forms because we'll have opted you explicitly into it. And then you can, at whatever pace you want to do, go through your own applications and start switching to typed forms by opting back out.
Yeah.
Shut up and take my money. This is so exciting.
Could we have a schematic to undo the schematic so that we could get all the errors back in the compiler, and then we could run through it at a later date?
That's
just search for :any and remove it.
Well, yeah. What if your code base has tons of any's? I mean, not that I ever do that kind of thing.
But if you would want to try it out and then take it out if you Kai said, like, why wouldn't you just roll it back and get reset? Kai read my mind.
I'm just thinking that you might want to upgrade Angular to accept this any, and then at a later date, you might want to address your forms.
So one of the kind of detailed design points that we talk about is usually when we add any's in migrations, we don't physically add the word any. We create a type alias that refers to the specific migration. So like any for untyped forms or something like that.
Okay, you win totally. That's a good one.
Yeah,
well done.
And so it is entirely possible through search and replace that you could just delete these things.
Yeah, good on you. Okay, you outthought me there. You win.
Good job, Alex. All right, this was so cool. I love these discussions. I love this format. Really, the big reason why I wanted to do it like this is because I really think that the people on the Angular team are super cool. But it's like the Angular team is like kind of intimidating. But as you see, Dylan and Alex are super chill and super cool. So I just want to kind of mention, if you see CFPs or not CFPs, RFCs coming out, just feel free to interact with these guys because they're super chill, super friendly, not scary at all. Thank you so much for. I just want to mention real quick, we have a couple of events coming up. Next week we have Storybook Office Hours with Kai Roeder. That's very exciting. And then the day after that we have Ask an Angular GDE. Sonder and I and Ari probably, and a couple of other GDEs will just be answering all of your questions. So come and join us. And I just got confirmation, like literally while we were in this call, we have Doug Parker coming from the CLI team on December 2nd. And I have not met Doug Parker yet, but he seems really cool. So I'm excited about that. Yeah, so that's it. I want to end like I always. Oh, Ronan reminded me about Dylan. Listen, Dylan, I just have to say, I would love to see you playing music again. So if you play anything, you just need to share it with us. We would be so happy because the world needs more of your music. Thank you for reminding me, Ronan. Okay, this is my favorite part of the call. I want everybody to come off mute and thank our guests.
Thank you, guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alex, thanks, guys.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.